So as Ryan was saying, will you mute yourself, Ryan? Thanks. Okay. Can't resist. We're going to be talking about temporary exhibits today. So what we're actually going to be showing you guys, this is for anyone who was at the last webinar, that one was a little bit more interactive, and this one will kind of be showing you some COVES data, but there will definitely be opportunity for like questions and a little bit of discussion at the end. But what we're going to do is we were asked to present some COVES data related to temporary exhibits at a meeting back in April called the Science Museum Exhibit Collaborative. They just asked for some information that COVES might have about the temporary exhibits from the data we've been collecting. So what we chose to do was we looked at so many COVES institutions with so many different temporary exhibits that have visited multiple institutions. We looked for any that had visited multiple COVES institutions for like a full run for when we had data available. So we came down to, I think, 4 exhibits, and we compared some different demographics and performance-related data for the exhibit visiting 2 different museums. So comparing the same exhibit across different museums. And then we're also going to share with you a little bit of a teaser of some data from the aggregate report that we are drafting up right now that should be finished just in time for Aztec. And you'll all be able to get a copy whether you're at Aztec or not at your institution. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into my presentation here. So let me see. Pardon me as I get the screen share going. And okay. All right. Is that good? See my screen? Awesome. Okay. So what we want to talk about with temporary exhibits, as I was kind of telling you, as we all know, COVES is about, why isn't it switching? Oh, there we go. COVES is about comparisons, right? So one of the things we were looking at that we had been able to do in the past with our temporary exhibit data at the Museum of Science, for instance, was we would compare the performance of a temporary exhibit like our Science Behind Pixar exhibit to the performance of other temporary or traveling exhibits that we had at our own institution, like Mirror Maze, or now we have Body Worlds, the Space Out of Gravity Experience, our Trains exhibit, which is helpful for a lot of things. But what COVES gave us the opportunity to do was to compare what was happening during the Science Behind Pixar's run at our museum, as well as other museums that it had gone to, because lots of the museums that participate in COVES end up getting the same traveling exhibits. We won't actually, Museum of Science Pixar data is not included in this, but we are able to talk a little bit about Pixar as an exhibit. And all of the museums that we kind of show data for are totally anonymized. They're just kind of like Institution A, Institution B. And these are the 4 exhibits that we were able to look at in the COVES data that we had, or that we have, that had visited multiple COVES institutions and had completed their full run. So interestingly, they're kind of across the map. Game Masters, the exhibition, and then Science Behind Pixar, Mindbender Mansion, and Hot Wheels Race to Win. We have kind of a combination of some that were upcharged at some institutions versus some that typically weren't upcharged. Some that kind of appeal to more younger audiences like Hot Wheels versus something like Game Masters, which is kind of pitched a little bit older. So we were kind of excited to see the variety of exhibits that we had there. And just to start out, I will throw this up and say, maybe state the obvious a little bit, is that when we're thinking about these exhibits and their run at different institutions, we're leaving out a lot of different contexts. So we're not, the COVES data doesn't allow us to say anything about whether the exhibit made money for this institution, or whether their attendance was up, or any other number of contextual factors that might play into, whether the exhibit was quote unquote a success or not, or whether any particular other museum should book that traveling exhibit for their institution. And that's okay. What we really are hoping is that this type of analysis can provide some paths forward and some examples of ways that COVES data can be useful for temporary exhibits, not necessarily as the sole judge or the sole way to interpret whether or not an exhibit was successful. So, and that was a big discussion that happened at this meeting as well, was we talked about all of the contextual factors that might go into why we were seeing differences between different exhibitions at different institutions. And a great opportunity to share and compare data in the future between any museum that wants to, learn more about how a temporary exhibit performed. If you're considering bringing one to your institution and you realize that another COVES museum had it, to look at your COVES data and compare the two, along with any number of other, operational or experience-related data that you might collect. So we focused on 4 questions for our analysis. So they were, what proportion of the audience visits, so like a capture rate, is the exhibit driving attendance? And we do that by looking at motivation to visit, where they motivated to see a specific exhibit, program, or show. Is the exhibit drawing a quote-unquote different audience than at different institutions? And is the exhibit affecting the overall experience? So do we see any differences in NPS or OER, overall experience rating, or any of the individual experience ratings that COVES collects data about? So we're going to go through those one by one and use each exhibit kind of as an example. So just looking at what proportion of the audience visits. So as our example here, we'll look at Hot Wheels Race to Win. So this graph here is showing Hot Wheels Race to Win at one of the COVES institutions that had it. So the darkest graph there is the percentage of visitors on the COVES survey who said that they visited Hot Wheels. And that's in comparison to 4 other temporary exhibits that that institution had had. So this is within institution. So at this institution, if you look at Hot Wheels versus a number of their other temporary exhibits, it looks like Hot Wheels was one of the more highly visited temporary exhibitions that they had had in recent memory. When you compare that to the other institution that had Hot Wheels, sorry, I don't know what took so long there. At institution 2, Hot Wheels was also highly visited, even more highly visited. And then when you compare their other temporary exhibits, Hot Wheels Race to Win also kind of came up as one of the more highly visited exhibits that they had had. So both within institution and between institutions, we were seeing Hot Wheels as having a pretty high visitation rate according to the COVES survey. So it's really helpful, for thinking about, okay, well, a lot of people came to Hot Wheels when it was at this institution, but does that trend kind of carry across multiple institutions that it visits? And according to this, we think yes, it did. Is the exhibit driving attendance? So, that's one thing that a lot of us, hope when we bring a temporary or traveling exhibition, is that it will motivate people to visit, maybe if they haven't visited before, maybe if they hadn't visited in a long time. So we wanted to kind of look at that. Does it actually, do these exhibitions actually drive attendance in some way? What we can look at. So this is a slightly different comparison. We're looking at the science behind Pixar, and this is the overall percentage of groups who said they were motivated, at least in part, to see a specific exhibit, program, or show. So this is at one institution that had Pixar and was in COVES, and the comparison we can look at here is the previous year so Pixar, say it was there like during the summer. I don't actually remember what the date was. So then the bar on the left would be the previous summer, and the bar on the right would be the summer afterward, where maybe there was another temporary exhibit or maybe there wasn't. So we see when Pixar was there, just over a third of groups were selecting that they were motivated to see a specific exhibit, program, or show. And remember, in COVES, you can select your top 2 motivations of that list. But it was, higher than the same time period in the year before and the year after at this institution. If you look at Pixar visitors only within this institution, over half of them were motivated to see a specific exhibit, program, or show. So that really kind of suggests that Pixar was motivating attendance to this institution while it was there. Did this hold true for our other institution that had Pixar? We can look at that. And kind of duplicating that middle bar here, while Pixar was at institution 2, 17% of visitors said they were motivated to see a specific exhibit, program, or show. But among Pixar visitors only, more than twice that many said they were motivated to see a specific exhibit, program, or show. So what this suggests to us is that yes, Pixar was motivating, visitors to attend. Obviously not like 100% of visitors, and not every single visitor who went to Pixar was motivated to see a specific exhibit, program, or show, but in comparison to the general audience that was there at the time, the percentages are higher. The next question that we look at is the exhibit drawing a different audience? And that's kind of across institutions. So I'll kind of explain what I mean here. So for another, now that we've got Mindbender Mansion here, so at institution 1, we looked at members just as an example. You could also look at like adult-only audiences or something like that, but look at members. Overall, while the exhibit was there, member visitation was 42%, and that was just about on par for visitors to Mindbender Mansion. So members were visiting Mindbender Mansion pretty much proportionally to the general, that they were in the general population during that time. Was this true for the other exhibits that had Mindbender Mansion? Actually, when we looked at the data for the other 2 institutions that had it, it looked like proportionally members were more likely to visit Mindbender Mansion. So this is one of the areas where we really were thinking about context, and like obscuring the institutions that these are makes it really hard to do that. But of course, that's what we do in COVES. As COVES presenting data, we don't kind of reveal who each institution is. But in a more in a one-on-one setting or a institution-to-institution type of facilitated sharing setting, the conversation around this would be very rich. You could talk about what time of year you had Mindbender Mansion, and if the members tend to visit more during that time or less during that time anyway, or any other, if members are a big portion of your general audience usually, or if they're a smaller portion of your general audience. So there's a lot of context that could go into this as well. But it was interesting to us to see that the trend did not necessarily hold for membership visitation at this particular exhibit across 3 institutions. And this too, we decided to look at another institution, or another exhibit rather, sorry, that had, for if the exhibit was drawing a different audience. So here, Hot Wheels Race to Win, we're looking at one of the institutions that it visited. And so it looked like, in this case, Hot Wheels was drawing slightly fewer members than were in the overall sample, and slightly fewer locals as well. So that was kind of an interesting point to us, that maybe Hot Wheels was drawing some of those people who were, it's not a huge difference, right? And we didn't do any kinds of testing to say, oh, is this a significant difference? We just kind of looked to see what the comparisons were. But maybe personally, when I was looking at this Hot Wheels exhibit, I kind of would have expected that it would be a little bit more of a member draw, just knowing about some of the demographics of members, and that they might tend to visit with young children. And, this is a type of exhibit that I bet, younger children would have a lot of fun with. But actually, that wasn't what we saw in the data. So it's always fun to see something where your intuitions are not proven correct. And this actually held true for the other institution that had Hot Wheels Race to Win as well. Slightly fewer members were visiting, proportionally visiting, as well as slightly fewer locals. So that was, slightly suggestive that the exhibit was appealing to people who were not, your frequent visitors or your, local audiences, that it might be getting a slightly broader population to come visit, which is interesting to see. And then the final question, maybe one of the trickiest questions, is the exhibit affecting the overall experience? And here, even though this is the way we phrase this question, it's really still pretty tough to say whether the exhibit is affecting the overall experience. What we can say is, there were differences between exhibit visitors and non-visitors for this time period, but it's still, based on the data we have, very challenging to say, whether or not visiting the temporary exhibit was, a key factor in the differences between these 2 ratings. There's potential for COVES to look more directly at that, and at the Museum of Science, actually, with our Body Worlds exhibit right now, we're trying to collect some more Body Worlds specific data from COVES. So for instance, collecting a Net Promoter Score about the Body Worlds exhibit specifically, rather than just comparing Net Promoter Scores for Body Worlds visitors and people, and the overall during the time, or Body Worlds non-visitors. But that's kind of a new effort. So just keep that in mind. Take it with a grain of salt, but still, I hope you find the comparisons interesting. So we look at Game Masters, our 4th exhibit. This one I find very interesting. For overall during the exhibit run, the percentage of visitors who said that they had a superior experience, if you recall, that's the top of the scale. That's for the overall experience rating. That's people who really had a great time. Slightly higher ratings for those people who visited Game Masters compared to overall. And the Net Promoter Score for Game Masters visitors was also higher. And nicely we see here that there's a big sample size for the Net Promoter Score, which means it's a little bit more trustworthy or less volatile. And also, we looked at a few different the experience ratings for Game Masters. We thought entertainment experience is probably a good thing to look at for Game Masters, kind of an entertainment-focused exhibit, and value for the cost because it was upcharged at this institution. So interestingly, for people who visited Game Masters, we saw that they gave higher ratings to entertainment experience and higher ratings to value cost. These differences do look pretty small, but on the scale of our ratings, those are relatively large differences. So I found that very interesting about Game Masters. The other, this is not a perfect comparison because the other institution that had Game Masters, I think it was like a really small sample size for some reason, or much smaller than we had before. So actually decided to compare it to Pixar because that was another upcharged exhibit. So for this one, we don't have the OER data because it wasn't yet on the COVES survey. But when we look at Pixar, at this institution, this other institution, they also saw a slightly higher net promoter score than overall during the exhibit's run. But to muddy the picture a little bit and to reference the grain of salt I kind of brought up earlier, the differences in experience ratings are virtually non-existent. So they didn't really see any differences between value cost or entertainment experience. And to kind of throw, a third institution in now that also had Pixar. For this one, we saw people who visited Pixar in the dark purple here were more likely to give a superior rating, but their net promoter score was lower. What does that mean? Maybe we can talk about it in a few minutes. And they also saw some inconsistent patterns for the experience ratings. Slightly lower value cost ratings for Pixar visitors, slightly higher entertainment experience ratings, although these differences are not even as large as the ones we saw for Game Masters. So the picture for whether or not a temporary exhibit is affecting the overall experience is I would say, pretty unclear. It might be that this is genuinely an effective Pixar, right? Like that people did find it had a lower value for the cost, or it might be that Pixar was just not a huge factor in people's ratings of this, that other things were going into these ratings. I think that there is a lot more that we can learn about how visiting temporary exhibits affects a visitor's overall experience at the museum. Got a question. Do the overall numbers exclude visitors who went to the special exhibit being looked at? No, they don't. We decided to do the comparison that way to have give a baseline for overall and then compare the exhibit visitors. The trend would be the same, but we decided to do the comparison this way in general. Okay, and then Ryan, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll jump in. So actually, that question is a great segue because as Alex has just explained, the analyses we did for the SMEC presentation that we just showed you, we're looking at within exhibit, right? Pixar to Pixar, Game Masters to Game Masters. And this is a really good way to control for content or quality of the temporary traveling exhibition. I know a lot of questions that we get asked dealing with all these experience data are, how can we be predictive of future temporary exhibit performance in relation to the overall visit experience? And it's really challenging because we very rarely have this lens to look within exhibit. COVES has been one of the first ways that Alex and I have seen that we've been able to do that. So thinking about that is interesting, but another analysis that we did specific to this question about overall numbers excluding visitors, maybe who didn't go to the temporary exhibit, are what we undertook for this year's coming fiscal year report, which Alex already plugged, being available at Aztec in Toronto. So Alex, if you can unscreen share for a second, I am going to show everyone this beautiful, beautiful document that I worked on. Do you see it? Or is it not beautiful? You see it? Oh man, okay, great. So all of these rows represent all of the temporary exhibits that were present at one of or many of your institutions at some point in the last fiscal year. So as you can see here, 47 rows, minus up, 45 temporary exhibits, starting in early July, ending in late June for this most recent year. And there's a ton of data that are contained in our COVES data set pertaining to any one of these temporary exhibits that we tried to look at somewhat holistically. And by that, I just mean in the aggregate, to make some statements about temporary exhibit visitation. So Alex, go back to the slideshow. Yeah, okay, so, and what you're seeing here is obviously the cover of our new report and the page that some of the data are going to be on. And this is exciting because we've never really been able to have such a large sample size when evaluating what temporary exhibits, any temporary exhibit, could do to some of the facets of the visit experience. And what we're starting to see echo a lot of what Alex has already said, which in my opinion is fascinating because here, if we're looking at all of the temporary exhibits together, we're really taking that content and quality piece out. We're saying any temporary exhibit. And the analyses focused explicitly on the time period that the temporary exhibit was available, looking only at the difference between visitors who went to the temporary exhibition and those who didn't, even though they had the chance. So if you'll scroll to the next slide, you can see here that, as Alex already mentioned, the motivations swing heavily in favor of coming to see something specific. 20% jump in, I came for a specific reason. And this is great because one of the reasons or one of the theories we have about bringing temporary or traveling exhibitions to our institutions is that it's going to bring people here. If people are coming specifically to see this temporary or traveling exhibition, we know that they're walking in the door for this great thing that we have. Similarly, they're staying at our institutions longer, not quite, but almost a half hour longer. And this may seem paltry in terms of the overall stay, but when we look at the average duration for the visit, it's right in there under 3 hours. So we're saying that temporary exhibitions are causing people to stay at our institutions longer. And if you jump down one more slide, we can see that there are differences in the experience ratings as well. Ignore those ends. We have to plug this in. This is just a draft version as we continue to make improvements. But here we see that for visitors who report attending the temporary exhibition, the educational experience is slightly higher. Conversely, the value for cost rating is slightly lower. Now, in dealing with the aggregate data, we lose a lot of the patterns within institution or within temporary exhibition, like Alex has been detailing. And we don't control for where these exhibitions go, to free institutions or to institutions charging admission. Similarly, they don't account for institutions that are upcharging these temporary exhibitions or not. And there's a huge mix in here of both of those types of exhibitions. So it's not surprising to me that we see a little bit of the discrepancy in the value for cost, but this is a big thing to pay attention to because I know a lot of our senior staff focus on this. Should we upcharge it? Should we not? What is it doing to the perceived value of the visit if we package them in a certain way or just include them as another thing to visit during your stay? So we've got a lot more thoughts about temporary exhibitions in general. But that was just kind of like a little bit of a glimpse into what we're able to glean from the huge amount of data in the last fiscal year across all of the COVES institutions. And we'd love to open it up to a little bit of a conversation now around what you're starting to think about at your institutions or what you're hoping COVES data could be used for moving forward. So we can use a combination of the chat box, but we can also feel free to unmute yourselves and just jump right in. Unless, Alex, did you have anything else to follow up with?
No, I don't think so. Yeah, just excited to hear what questions other people have about the analyses we did, or we can take the conversation to talk about, temporary exhibits at your institution.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and read from the chat box. Jessica is asking if we plan on looking at the value cost rating separately for upcharges versus no upcharge. I would say yes. We won't have the opportunity to do that within this year's aggregate report, but this can definitely be something that we track for the future in addition to supplementing this year's aggregate report. We've got some information, but as many of you likely know, when we get your experience list or you tell us that the temporary exhibition has changed from one to another or as you've got a new one coming. We typically don't get the information about if it's an upcharge or how much, but we're hoping to track that. For the SMEC analyses, we actually did reach out to all of those institutions and ask if it was upcharged or not. So this is part of our plan in supplementing the current analysis. Megan Scheidel asks, when do we expect to put the report out? Great question. It will be going to print in about 2.5 weeks, and then another 2-week turnaround. It should be in our hands the day before the Aztec conference, because we really love a good hard deadline, and we want to be able to give it to all of you wonderful people, and then so you can disseminate it within your institution. So we will have hard copies in person. We're going to save some hard copies in case you're not able to pick one up in person, and then it's also going to be available digitally right around that time, last week of September. Can you give some insight on how this type of analysis can be used to look at an institution's individual data? That's a great question, Andrea. So one of the ways that Alex and I have been encouraging people to do this type of small-scale analysis of their own data in just one temporary or traveling exhibition is to use the visitation bar chart on your dashboard to look at people who have gone, and then use an advanced filter for people who didn't, which is kind of the negative space in that bar chart. Alex, if you're comfortable, I'm going to turn it over to you, because I know that setting is a little bit tricky if you're not a very sophisticated dashboard user as yourself.
Do you want me to demo it really quick?
That would be awesome, yeah.
Okay, yeah, sure. It's a little bit of a weird quirk of the dashboard that is not it's not as intuitive as you might think. But hopefully I can do it without giving away anyone's data here. But what Ryan is kind of suggesting is comparing, like, taking the the time period when the exhibit was there at the museum, and comparing kind of what Megan, I think SMM might be Megan Goki. Your question was, comparing exhibit visitors to like exhibit non-visitors. So directly people who could have visited the temporary exhibit but didn't, and then people who did visit the temporary exhibit. So I'll kind of see if I can do this here.
This will be a great test, because I was going to say I'll just jot down some notes about how to do this in the future, but we'll have a live recording of step-by-step instructions if we're able to pull this off on how to use these filters on your own dashboards to investigate your own data specific to temporary exhibits.
Actually, I worry about doing this on the spot and showing data that don't belong to people. Yeah, well, okay, I'll do that. I'll use the aggregate data, and I'll just do something that doesn't really make sense, just so you guys can see. So, do you see the dashboard now? Whoa. I'm sorry, my Zoom just is frozen. Ryan? No, okay. Oh, sorry, yikes. Okay, and you can see the dashboard. So you see this thing that says advanced filter. If your dashboard doesn't have it for some reason, I'll make sure to add it, but I've been adding it to people's dashboards because it's the only way to do the I didn't visit X thing. Can you go back a step? Yep. At the very top bar here, where you see all the filters that pop up, date, calendar year, we're just in that COVES data dashboard, just the aggregated data right now. So, this is fiscal year 18 for some reason, but 13,000 responses. And you look for the advanced filter. And what you would do is you would find your CDO variable, which is what we call the what you saw or did at the museum, and specifically highlight doesn't include, whatever experience it is. This won't have the data showing up correctly, but if it was a temporary exhibit, you would just select the temporary exhibit, and that's how you would do it. And it won't make sense to apply the filter right now, but it's an advanced filter, and you want to specifically say that something does not include that exhibit.
So that would present the data for visitors who did not attend the temporary exhibit. And one thing you would want to do there is specify the date range, right? You set the date range before going to the advanced filter, Alex?
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
The nice thing, can you scroll down? I'm not sure if the aggregate dashboard will have, it shouldn't have any of those temporary exhibits, right?
No, because it's got
on your individual dashboards, anytime you have a temporary or traveling exhibit, in addition to all of your permanent experiences that are contained in one bar chart, you will have little, smaller, date-specific bar charts for, going to see Pixar, going to see Game Masters, going to see whatever. And, oh, thanks. SMM is offering to let us show their dashboard, Alex, if that's a possibility.
I'm still on the phone with you guys, but Zoom died for me, so it's going to take me a minute.
Okay, so while Alex is coming back to us, the advanced filter that Alex just showed, again, is the negative space, the visitors who did not go. So you could set that advanced filter, see, do, Pixar does not include anybody who said they went to Pixar. And if you have the date filter set right for the opening and closing dates of the exhibit, all of the data that populate your dashboard will be specific to visitors who did not go. Once you clear that filter out, if you want to see the visitors who did go, all you have to do is go down to that. Oh,
there we go.
Alex is back. Yeah. All you have to do is go down to that bar chart, which is, the Pixar visitation widget, and you click on it, and that will select all the visitors who did report going. So then the dashboard will filter by that as well. So you then have, it won't be side by side, but you'll be able to pull all of the data you need specific to visitors who did go and visitors who did not.
Cool. Wow, sorry, I missed it. SMM was volunteering to...
If we want to do a specific example, you can use SMM's dashboard, and maybe we'll just pull one of the old temporary exhibits that they have had a full run for.
Sorry, that got so weird. I don't know what happened.
And I want to thank Megan and everyone at SMM for volunteering to share data. As everyone may be aware, we will never share data without your permission, but there has been a big push, at least within many of the COVES institutions who have been vocal in the community, about being more open with data sharing and less protective. Again, Alex and I and COVES, the core team, we will never share your data without your permission, but we're finding more and more that people want to reach out to each other about sharing. So if you're open to that, you should use the community of practice and simple email to say like, hey, I'd be interested in learning more about your data specific to this, because that has been a big effort within the COVES leadership group in the last year. So just throwing that out there. Alex, the dashboard is still coming up. While that's happening, I'm going to go ahead and read Carla's comment. Specific exhibits are different in content. How can this type of analysis support planning for future temporary exhibits? For example, what type of content would draw more people? Question above is related about how COVES data help planning for future exhibits. So Carla, that's a great question. A lot of the attention that we gave to the SMEC analyses had to do with drawing new audiences, but as you note, the specific exhibits were specific in content. So if we looked within exhibition, we could look for drawing different audiences. One thing that this type of analysis might support is looking for exhibitions broadly that bring in different types of audiences, maybe specifically adult-only audiences or specifically very young audiences. We know that there are some of the temporary exhibits in our long list of the 45 included in this year's aggregate report that are children's focused exhibit. Thomas the Train, Dora the Explorer, Wild Kratts. So there are some specific exhibits out there catering to young kids, but we might find some other types of exhibits that do different things. Alex's example for Hot Wheels, bringing in more out-of-town visitors, was really interesting. So we can think about leveraging these data to think about different types of audiences. Drawing more people is harder to answer. One of the efforts that we're undertaking right now is layering the experience data that COVES provides with operational data, such as attendance numbers. I highly doubt we'll ever get into revenue, because that seems to be a much more sticky topic. But if we just think about attendance numbers, thinking about ways that temporary exhibits draw more people, regardless of who the people are, is one thing we can use COVES to do. And at this year's Aztec in Toronto, the session that many of us are participating on focuses on that topic exactly. How can we layer experience data and operational data to draw more insights, not just about temporary exhibits, but about the experience overall? I see another comment. I'm going to let Alex go with the demonstration.
So what I was just quickly trying to pull up here is, as a random example, people who did not visit the Mental Health Mind Matters exhibit at SMM. So the exhibit was open from May 4th, 2018 to January 6th, 2019. So you restrict that, and then you use that advanced filter to say it doesn't include Mental Health Mind Matters. And then if you wanted to, go back and do Mental Health Mind Matters again, you would just reset that filter, and it would show you people who did visit. And it's just important to keep it when you look at people who didn't visit to that time period, just because obviously you'll get people, if you don't do that, you'll get people who visited when the exhibit was not there. So of course it didn't visit because the exhibit wasn't available. So just looking at that comparison, it looks like the Net Promoter Score for people who didn't visit Mental Health Mind Matters was slightly higher. Who knows exactly what that means, but if you were looking for that data, that's how you would get that. Thanks again, SMM. And if you have any specific questions about how to get that advanced filter on your dashboard, just email me and I'll make sure you have it. It's not too hard.
Okay, so the next comment. So SMM asked a question about looking at attended the special exhibit versus not attending the special exhibit. I tried to respond in the chat box. As you saw on that big wonky spreadsheet, a lot of institutions simultaneously had 2 or more traveling or temporary exhibitions. So it was impossible to isolate attending one versus not another. So to do that, I created a variable that said attended any of the possible traveling or temporary exhibitions versus did not attend only if one was available. And that's how we parse the data into a dichotomous view. Elisa's question asks, on our version of the COVE survey, we ask a follow-up if someone selects exhibit, film, program as a reason for visiting, so we can identify what the specific motivating factor was, e.g. film, temporary exhibit, or permanent exhibit. Is that true for any other COVES institution, so you can determine more specifically that if the temporary exhibit, as opposed to a film, was a motivating factor? Yes, Elisa, almost everyone asks that question. Most institutions ask it as a follow-up with a select one list afterwards, which specific exhibit, program, or show were you specifically hoping to see? And a couple ask it in a very open-ended way, and then those institutions code their own data. So we are able to look at the specific exhibit that is the motivating factor.
When we were doing the first presentation I was showing, the spec presentation, we were drawing mostly on data before we had added that question as a core COVES question. So, for example, we were talking about in the comparisons for motivation to visit with Pixar at different institutions, we didn't have the data for those institutions saying, yes, I came for Pixar. So the best we could do with those data was to say, okay, but were Pixar visitors more likely to say they came for a specific exhibit, program, or show? But now we mostly could say, okay, were they saying that it was Pixar, or were they saying that it was something else?
All right, another one of the questions in the chat box is from Betsy, who asks about a Colleen Dillenschneider post who basically that the emphasis on promoting time-sensitive experiences like temporary exhibits is promoting the idea that it's not worth coming to the museum when there are just the permanent exhibits. Is there any data in COVES that might probe that question? Does visitation get suppressed when there are no temp exhibits on view? So again, we have a really hard time addressing questions of visitation because we don't collect attendance figures specific to the day, even though I ask you all, and you're very gracious to provide them, for the daily attendance numbers kind of retroactively so I can plan your targets. What we don't do is layer that onto your COVES dashboard because we haven't got permission and we haven't figured out the best mechanism for doing that. It would never be available in real time. It would only be available 12 months later. But again, this is something that we're hoping to start digging into as time goes on. In response to a lot of Colleen Dillenschneider's posts, the one thing I can say about this is what we have noticed in previous analyses, not the ones we focused on here, was often that temporary or traveling exhibitions filled a role for drawing some of your core audience back in times between the blockbusters. And by blockbusters, I'm not even sure what I mean because I don't have a good label for what a blockbuster is, but that those temporary exhibits provide something different for visitors to do. Perhaps if they're members, perhaps if they're locals, perhaps if they have young kids. And not that like, oh, we have this shiny thing and this is the only time you should visit, but hey, we've got a ton of great content in addition to this thing. As Alex mentioned, we've got body worlds right now, and we've done some additional investigation into body worlds, and we're just probing awareness of the exhibit. And so it's clear to us that some visitors who come aren't even aware of the temporary exhibition that you might be promoting. So I'm not entirely sold on the Colleen Dillon Schneider finding, although I know that she's got a different data source that she uses to put out a lot of those articles.
In response to Rebecca's question here, can you clarify if we have more than one traveling exhibit, whether we can filter by only one? And the answer is yes, definitely. As long as your survey asks visitors specifically if they visited each temporary exhibit by name, you'll be able to filter for them. So if you were to put, visited a temporary exhibit, then you couldn't, but it's totally within our control and power to isolate those experiences, as long as they're on your survey. And to kind of go back a little bit to questions like Carla's question a little bit about planning for future temporary exhibits and how COVES data could help that. One conversation that's been coming up a lot in our world is if a lot of institutions, when they're thinking about and planning for a temporary exhibit, will end up calling people at another institution that has had that exhibit and saying, how did it do? And your people who are answering you are drawing on certain data sources like attendance or revenue or ticket sales or something. That COVES data could be part of that conversation. That COVES data, if there are people at your institution who are part of that decision making who are not yet familiar with COVES data or integrated into kind of the COVES ecosystem at your institution, to bring that to their attention, that other institutions are participating in this project, collecting data, visitation, experience ratings, motivation related data, anything that they're interested in about these temporary exhibits, and that we could compare really easily across multiple institutions that had those exhibits. So that's something we're trying to encourage here at the Museum of Science is, if we're considering a temporary exhibition or have questions about a particular type of temporary exhibition, to go to institutions that we would be calling anyway and asking questions of anyway, and asking them to integrate more COVES data into their accounting of how that exhibition performed when they had it.
And then there's another question from Carla, who asks if the COVES report is going to touch on core audiences and temporary exhibits. So the short story is that we will talk about both core audiences and temporary exhibits, but not core audiences in temporary exhibits. It gets very complicated, as you can imagine, with so many different potential avenues to go down for these, quote unquote, deeper dives. So with the limited space that we have in the report, we choose to talk about overall findings, which is a summary of everyone's data, and then break it down into these different categories, like looking at members versus non-members, looking at locals versus non-locals, which we did last year. In this case, this year, looking at temporary exhibit visitors versus visitors who did not attend the temporary exhibit if it was available. Looking at groups who have different age ranges of kids is another one that's going to be included in this year's report. But they're very brief because there's so much data that it gets a little complicated to talk about all of the COVES data points in relation to that one lens. And we do it mostly to draw out some of the findings that we find interesting so that you all can go back to your data and say, hey, does this resonate with us? Are we seeing differences in these temporary exhibit audiences? Are we seeing difference in these different age range of kids if they're coming with adults? And how can we respond to that? And hopefully it promotes more of a conversation with you and us about ways we can dissect the larger data set in the future. So it's a bear, trust me. You all know that there's a lot of data in your own dashboards, and when we put it all together, it's even more, let's call it exciting.
A couple of other examples of things we're comparing. So we're looking at members versus non-members, and the temporary exhibit visitors versus not. We're also looking at groups that brought different ages of children. So groups that brought young children, like 7 and under, groups that brought kids 7 and older, and then groups that brought like mixed age groups of children, so like young and old kids together, to see if there are any differences among them. And then we're also looking at, because this is our second year of reporting this way, aggregate, we're comparing, museums that participated this year and participated last year to see if there were any differences in the aggregate across museums who participated both years. And then there's a couple other things as well, but just kind of as a teaser for some of the things we're going to be looking at.
Okay, well, we do these monthly webinars to create the community and to start sharing some of the things that we find interesting. If there are no more questions, though, we don't have to. We got another question. Everyone hang tight. Again from SMM, have you or do you plan to do any sort of analysis that looks at the factors that impact overall experience rating or NPS the most? This is looking at special exhibits, but it could be really interesting to see if across museums, entertainment experience rating is most closely related to Net Promoter Score, whereas, say, restrooms have a little impact. Might be way messier than I'm considering, but that could be really fun. So this is a great question. And actually, the example you use overall should be possible in the dashboard. There are those two correlation matrices that first consider all of the experience ratings and then what we're calling loyalty ratings, education, entertainment, value, cost in relation to Net Promoter Score. And then again, those experience ratings, so staff helpfulness, restrooms, gift shop, restaurants, if you've got them, in relation to the Net Promoter Score. So those are isolating the relationship between one of those ratings and Net Promoter Score, and you can look at all of them together. I think what your analysis question is suggesting is there a multivariate way that we can combine these data, perhaps at the aggregate level, to look at the factors most closely related with pushing Net Promoter Score or OER. And I know this has come up at a couple of the trainings that we've done in the last year. People are really fascinated by this idea of how do we move someone up, one scale point on the Net Promoter Score scale? How do we push someone from excellent to superior? And that is a plan. We have not started that analysis yet because, as you know, it gets really messy, especially when we think about the multitude of data that we have. But this is continuing to be of interest when we do new trainings with all of you, and we know that we've got a rich data set to investigate it. So this is part of what we hope to do in the near future. Okay, Beth, the good question that's worth asking, even though it's like a little heart palpitating, palpitation causing. No, that's okay. Did you run any tests for statistical significance both between the temp exhibit and the non-temp exhibit visitors as well as across institutions? I'm curious how the characteristics of different institutions may influence how visitors experience a particular temporary exhibit. So the short answer is no. We didn't do any inferential testing this year to talk about the differences in the data that we're seeing. Last year, we used those inferential tests to guide the findings that we published in the report, but we're staying away from inferential testing for two reasons currently. One is in January of this year, the American Statistical Association put out a paper that basically said, don't let P is less than 0.05 guide your thinking. They're encouraging this broadly. It's starting to be incorporated into most of the peer-reviewed journals that we publish in or that you might be researching. But there's a lot of trepidation about relying solely on statistical significance testing to choose to publish or not. And that is really the second reason why we're not doing it. We don't want to let statistical significance create a publishing bias or, I think it's called publishing bias, when we only report the things that are statistically significant. In fact, another teaser about this year's report is that there is almost no change whatsoever in those big NPS and OER ratings when you look at the aggregate, which says to me that the COVES as a field has kind of identified what the benchmark NPS and OER levels are. But within that, within institution, as Beth points out, there's huge variation. So we're not doing statistical significance testing for this report, although I can almost guarantee you that should we push some of these to peer-reviewed journal articles, which we hope to do, we're going to need to deal with that directly as well. Beth's other point about the characteristics of different institutions definitely does influence how visitors experience a particular temporary exhibit. That was evident when Alex ran those within exhibit analyses, and when I look at the aggregate data set and think about how different each one of these institutions are, it's worth acknowledging the fact that we're absolving the data of those institutional variations to look at trends in whatever subsection of analysis that we're looking at.
And
So
though those differences between institutions, I think that became really apparent at the meeting when we presented the different, the within exhibit but across institution analyses. And our great hope for that was that those data would kind of spur a further conversation between institutions who had had those exhibits to, talk about their own contextual factors that they knew better than we ever could, and to kind of give people supporting tools for having those conversations further.
And the next question is directly related to all of this from Jessica. Have you thought about incorporating measures of dispersion like error bars to help describe the data? Yes, we have. In fact, we've had some pretty good conversations around the value for including them and then the confusion they might cause. If you've looked at last year's report, you know that it is a relatively simplistic view of complex data in the sense that most of the data are presented graphically, not layered on top of one another to try and tell a story that might be apparent from the data. If we were to include measures of dispersion, the story, it gets much more fuzzy math, right? Like you'll be able to see the imprecision with the measurement, which is great for those of us who are familiar with error bars or like to see those aspects of dispersion and variation, but not for the average reader who this is also designed for. So in my heart of hearts, and in a world where I have way more time to do nerdy reporting, I think we could create a very sophisticated report that explained a lot more of the variance that we're seeing in the data and why that's interesting. But that's not what this aggregate report is designed to do. Exactly, it's double-edged. It's worth talking about when you think about how the data can be used to make interpretations, but it's also complicating the picture a great deal. And this, one of the things that is present in both last year's report and this year's report, I'm sorry, I'm just using my hands to demonstrate the two reports here. On the margins of these deeper dive page, we present all of the net promoter scores, including the aggregate, so you can see some of that variation. But to do that with every data point we include in the report would be in a report in and of itself. So yes, there's a lot we could do. There's a lot we've discussed. So when you see this report, please don't think that we haven't considered many of these considerations, because it is the work of a lot of people. But the end result is what we hope, a pretty fascinating and easy read that you're able to pass on to some of the stakeholders at your institutions. And as a plug, since I don't see any more questions, although we do have time for maybe one or two more if they're there, as a plug for next month's webinar, if you are at the Aztec conference, that's awesome. We have so many things that COVES is going to do, including a happy hour, including at least one session, if not two. We've got a booth in the expo hall. We've got the COVES convening that all COVES participating institutional members are invited to. And we'll send out, excuse me, all of this information in an email and a posting to the COP so that you can participate. But if you're unable to be in Toronto, on the Thursday following conference, September 26th, at this time, 1 p.m. Eastern, we're going to do a debrief of everything that happened at the conference from the COVES perspective, including talking in much more detail about the aggregate report. So we can go through it in detail then. Hopefully you'll all have hard copies by that point, but if you don't, we'll mail some to your institution so you can have them. So with that said, I think we're going to wrap up August's COVES webinar. And we're so thankful that you all took an hour out of your busy days to spend time with us. And we can't wait to see you soon. So again, please join us in Toronto or come say hi to us if you are in Toronto.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Bye.